It was my turn to choose where we went camping, so I drove up to Huntsville. I went camping with 3 friends who came home for the weekend. They are all in college, and we usually get together at least once a year. We plan to go backpacking deep in the forest and live off of fish we catch and animals we can trap. We've been doing this for a while in Texas and many other places, so we're pretty much used to anything you'd encounter out there. We parked our car in a designated camping area and began to walk into the forest. We laughed a little while we went, and we caught up on each other's lives. We continued walking until nightfall, at which point we stopped, gathered wood to build a fire, set up our tent, and did what we always do, try to frighten each other with strange tales. Around this time we started to smell something very faint that was noticeable but not overbearing. We couldn't put our finger on what it was, so we just carried on. Mike had to go to the bathroom and he walked off in the forest. A second later he came running back looking like he'd stopped halfway through and wet himself immediately. We all crack up and throw some jokes at him, but then we noticed he was white as snow and trying to catch his breath he starts screaming for us to follow him and runs off. We all get serious and go follow him, not knowing what the problem was. We start to hear a faint scream and crying in the distance in the direction we were running. It was pitch black away from the camp and Mike had the only flashlight. We left ours at the camp, he had his from his trip. So at this stage we didn't have much choice but to follow the light, which was frantic, pointing here and there in front of him. The scream gets closer and Mike starts to slow down. We then noticed a ratty old cabin that looked like it was abandoned except for a faint light that we could see from one of the old Noah-covered windows. When Mike knocked on the front door, it stopped, and we all heard heavy footsteps walking quickly. There was a giant slam, and the sound of a bolt unlocking, but nothing happened. We waited for a while, knocked a few more times, but nothing happened. We walked around the house, and there was no way any of us were leaving each other's sides. When we noticed the window, which was a good way up, Alex took a deep breath and asked us to give him a boost so he could see inside. We watched him brush away dirt and webs from the window and put his face close to it to try to see something. There was a quick beat, and then he breathed in quickly and screamed loudly. He fell back from the window, screaming bloody murder the entire time. Mike and I tried to calm him down, but he was hysterical, so we went to him, but he began to shake. Punch, kick, whatever you want, and then we all ran closely behind him because we didn't want to be parted. We called up to him, grabbed him, and put him down because the fire was going out, so I took some wood we had gathered nearby and put it on the fire. My hands were shaking, and I had to do something. I returned to Alex, and we all attempted to soothe him once more, but he refused. Instead, he continued to scream and breathe so heavily that he passed out. We are all now afraid, and we kept the fire going. Up until sunrise, Alex kept waking up and screaming like usual. By sunrise, he was awake and appeared catatonic, mumbling to himself and whimpering. Mike and I decided to go look at the cabin. Now that it was daylight, we looked everywhere we thought it might be, but there was nothing there. The faint smell from the previous night had intensified into a strong smell of something stale and dead. We then returned to the campsite, where we discovered that Alex had chewed into the sides of his face and swallowed so much blood that he was throwing up. John, who was behind him, appeared to be dying of tiredness. I suppose that's how we all looked. It wasn't until I saw his face that I realized. We all began packing up the tent after Alex quietly told us that we had to leave. It was about noon. The sky was growing dark, and Alex began to panic. He grabbed a big stick and yelled at us to get out of the tent or he would knock us out and drag us out of there himself. When Mike began to yell at him, they got into a fight. We broke it up, finished packing, and then started to head back. After a short while, we came to a creek that we had crossed the day before, but it was flooded over and the water was moving too quickly for us to cross. Alex began to scream once more, accusing Mike of taking too long to pack up the tent when we could have left. This continued for a while until we eventually got Alex to calm down and tell us what had happened. He claimed that as soon as he put his face against the glass, a face on the other side did the same thing and began to smile enormously. It had dark eyes and a dark mouth that were much larger than Alex's, and the smile grew as big as it could. A giant shadow behind it swung something down and sliced its face off, leaving it stuck to the window. He claimed that it began to laugh softly as it slid down. Mike was still irritated, but he wouldn't acknowledge it was starting to get terrified and began to quarrel with him once more. Eventually, we began to follow the creek to find a crossing point, and as we did, we noticed toys floating in it. These were not just any old trash, though, there were a lot of them. Mike picked up one of the many baby dolls that had washed to the side. It had a dying voice. Chip that began to gurgle words that we couldn't understand, then it sounded like it was whispering. We assumed the batteries were dying, so he threw it down. We continued, and as the sun began to set, Alex became even more agitated, whimpering, and breathing heavily. We all started to see shadows move behind trees, something we all called BS on, until we were all seeing it. It was hardly light out, and we stopped when we saw the cabin directly in front of us. Mike claims that this is absurd. Alex attempts to stop him, but I'm going in there. We all want to go home. Mike tells us to get lost and do our own thing since he doesn't care anymore. This is all bullshit. Suddenly, we hear hundreds of the same kind of baby doll as before, whispering, trying to sing, and pushing forward past the cabin. We smelled something dead and stale, just like before, and then we heard someone crying and someone screaming. We continued driving until we finally crossed the creek and left the woods. It's completely dark when we get back to our car and head towards the 45 to Houston, but the road is under construction and cannot be accessed. It points to a detour. As we approach it, it appears to be a small bummy dirt road that leads into the woods, and as we approach the passenger side door, a young girl approaches us. She looks like she's been beaten up or drugged up. Alex doesn't open the door or roll down the windows. Instead, she goes for the doorknob, and he locks it in. She pushes her face against the window and beams broadly, and we all start to wail and shout. Finally, gasping for air, we turn onto a street that leads to the 45. We drive the entire distance, and when we get to my flat, nobody knows what to say, so we all split up and go our separate ways. Later, Mike texts me to say he's going back. I attempt to talk him out of it, but all he says is that we were playing tricks on ourselves. I think he went to show himself that he wasn't afraid because I can smell that stench everywhere. I don't go out anymore. I just stay inside and don't answer the door. Last week, when I went to my dad's house to have dinner with him, he just watched me strangely and didn't say anything at all. I kept asking him what was wrong, and he just slowly shook his head. When I turned to wave as I was leaving to go home, I was shocked to see that he had black eyes and an open mouth, as if he was in pain. He closed the door and fled. I called him and knocked repeatedly, but nothing came up. I even contacted the police, but halfway through the questions they were asking me, the connection began to drop to static, and I could hear a faint murmuring that was broken up by laughter and singing. When I call Alex's house, they act like I'm a salesman and tell me to stop calling because they don't know any Alex. Alex's mother tells me that I can't reach John. Someone knocked on my door. and when I went to look, I saw a face completely covering the peephole and a huge smile beginning to fall. I called the police again, but instead of static, they got really strange. Sir, are you using drugs right now? No. Are you coming home anytime soon? Excuse me, come home. The call ended, and my mail slot occasionally swings as someone slides pieces of baby dolls through it. I think I might be going crazy because when I try to call people right now, all I hear are static, horrible baby doll noises, and crying and screaming. My TV is broken, but when I go to the bathroom, I can hear it on. Recently, I heard enormous footsteps from the apartment next door, bangs, and something falling to the ground from the neighbors to the right. It sounded like a baby that never gets cared for, and then it sounded like a baby doll whose batteries are running low. Now that my phone has been ringing, Alex is speaking to me in a language I have never heard before and cannot even understand. I keep receiving emails with pictures of black people with tiny colors, but I am unable to access my email because someone knocks on the door, they slam against it, I hear the bolts unlocking one by one, and I rush to make sure I lock them all back before I sit down and start crying over more frightful, eerie scenes. Horror stories about pastors. View the on-screen video or the playlist.